The rain began just as Elias Tornes bettered Sid and coughed its way up the final, winding stretch of gravel drive. It isn't a gentle onset. On a moment the air was thick with the coppery tang of impending storm, the next, the sky tore open, dumping a torrent of cold, grey water that turned the world into a smeared watercolor. Through the frantic swish of the vipers, Blackfield Manor emerged from the gloom, not as a welcome sight, but as a jagged wound in the landscape. It was exactly as the Lyra's photograph had depicted it, a hulking Victorian monstrosity of dark brick and twisted gables, its windows like sightless eyes. Yet the photo had failed to capture its profound aura of neglect. Ivy, thick as a man's wrist, strangled the walls, and one of the twin towers had partially collapsed, spearing its brick guts down the side of the house like a grotesque scar. Elias felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. This was his inheritance. This decaying mausoleum was all that remained of his great uncle, Alistair Blackwood, a man had met exactly once, at a funeral 2 decades ago, who had smelled of mothballs and whispered strange, unsettling things about the angles of repose. Hal brought the Tsar to a halt before the grand, peering entrance, the engine ticking as it cooled. The letter from the law firm, Pynchon, had been a shock. Hal was a man who lived in the clean, logical lines of code, a freelance software architect whose life was contained within the glow of monitors. This place, with its organic rot and brooding silence, was the antithesis of everything Hal understood. But the inheritance was an inheritance, and Elias's bank account had been looking decidedly anemic. The stipulation was simple: reside at Blackfield Manor for a period of no less than 30 days to secure full ownership. After that, Hal could sell it, burn it to the ground for all the lawyers cared. Gathering his courage, Hal flung the Tsar door open and made a mad dash through the downpour, his suitcase held over his head as a pathetic shield. The massive oak door was unlocked. It swung inward with a groan that spoke of decades of disuse, revealing a cavernous foyer swallowed by shadows. The air inside was frigid and heavy with the smell of dust, damp, and something else, something sweetly organic, like forgotten flowers rotting in a vase. Elias fumbled for a light switch, his fingers brushing against rough, damp wallpaper. A single, bare bulb hanging from a chain high above flickered to life, doing little to dispel the gloom. It illuminated a grand staircase crawling with intricate, ornamented carvings, and a floor of black and white tiles, now cracked and filmed with grime. "Hello," Hal called out, his voice swallowed by the oppressive silence. The only response was the drumming of rain on the roof, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Hal spent the first hour exploring the ground floor. The rooms were a museum of decayed grandeur. A drawing room held furniture shrouded in dusty white sheets, looking like a congregation of ghosts. A library's shelves were bowed under the weight of leather-bound books, their titles faded into illegibility. A grand dining table, long enough to sit 20, was layered with a thick fur of dust. In every room, the wallpaper was peeling, and in the patterns of the damp patches, Elias's overactive imagination began to see faces, twisted forms, screaming mouths. It was in the study that Hal found the first real evidence of his great uncle. The room was a chaos of papers, strange brass instruments, and books laid open to complex astronomical charts. On the wall hung a large, detailed map of the manor and its grounds, annotated with tight, spidery script. On a note, circled repeatedly in red ink, caught his eye: "The house breathes. It listens. Do not speak of your dreams." Elias snorted. "Charming, Uncle Alistair. Absolutely charming." Hal decided the master bedroom on the second floor was the least likely to collapse on him overnight. The four-poster bed was a mammoth structure of dark wood, its mattress stained but seemingly dry. As Hal dumped his suitcase, his eye was drawn to the wall opposite the bed. Unlike the floral patterns elsewhere, this wall was bare plaster, and upon it, someone had drawn a series of intricate, interlocking geometric patterns in what looked like charcoal. They were complex, hypnotic, and deeply unsettling. They seemed to shift in the fading light, suggesting depths that shouldn't have been passable on a flat surface. Shaking off a sudden chill, Elias turned his back on the drawing and set up his laptop on a small, rickety desk. No Wi-Fi, of course. The storm had killed the cell signal too. He was truly cut off. He ate a cold sandwich from his provisions, the sound of his chewing unnaturally loud in the silence. The rain had lessened to a steady patter, and in the quiet, he began to hear the other sounds of the house, the creak of old timber settling, the skittering of what he hoped were mice in the walls, the wind whistling through a broken pane somewhere. And then, a whisper. It was so faint he almost mistook it for the wind. A sibilant rush of air that seemed to form a word just on the edge of hearing. He froze, sandwich halfway to his mouth, heart hammering against his ribs. Torn. He spun around, staring into the dark corridor beyond the open door. Nothing. Hello, he called again, his voice tighter this time. Is someone there? Silence. He was being ridiculous. It was the wind, the stress, the power of suggestion from his useless mad scribblings. He forced himself to finish his meal, but the appetite was gone. That night, sleep did not come easily. The bed smelled faintly of mildew and age. The house was a symphony of noises, each one a fresh assault on his nerves. Just as he was drifting into a fitful doze, he heard it again. Closer this time. Not from the corridor, but from the corner of the room. A dry, papery rustle, like pages turning. Then the whisper, clear and unmistakable. You are not alone here, Elias Thorne. He sat bolt upright, fumbling for the flashlight on his nightstand. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the empty corner. The geometric drawing on the wall seemed to pulse in the sudden light. He scanned the room, his breath misting in the freezing air. There was no one. But the words hung in the room, clinging to the cold like frost. The next few days bled into one another, a great tapestry of fear and growing isolation. Elias tried to busy himself with assessing the property, but the sheer scale of dereliction was overwhelming. Every room held a new horror, a doll with its porcelain face cracked in a silent scream, a closet full of moth-eaten clothes that still seemed to hold the shape of their long-dead owner, a music box that would sometimes tinkle a few discordant notes on its own, usually in the dead of night. The whispers became a constant companion. They were rarely clear, mostly just a susurrating chorus of voices that seemed to emanate from the very walls, growing louder when he was in certain rooms, like the library or the study. He began to talk back, at first out of anger, then out of a desperate need for any interaction. What do you want? He shouted at the wainscoting. The response was always a taunting, echoing silence, or a burst of faint, mocking laughter. He started sleeping with a knife from the kitchen under his pillow. His reflection in the grimy mirrors began to look haggard, his eyes shadowed with sleeplessness. He found himself studying the geometric pattern on his bedroom wall for hours, tracing the lines with his eyes until his head ached. There was a logic to it, a terrible, non-Euclidean logic that made his programmer's brain itch. It was a code, but written in a language of madness. On an afternoon, driven by a need to understand, he ventured into the library. If there were answers, they would be here, buried in Alistair Blatt's obsession. He pulled down books on architecture, on metaphysics, on obscure mathematics. Most were impenetrable. But in a heavy, leather-bound volume entitled On the Nonlinear Properties of Temporal Space, he found a sheaf of his useless notes stacked between the pages. The handwriting was even more frantic than on the map, the ink blotted in places as if the writer's hand had been shaking. Elias sat on the dusty floor, the weak light from a grimy window falling across the page. The house is not a structure, he read, it is an organism. A nexus. The geometry of its construction, passed down through generations, is not for aesthetic pleasure but for containment. The angles are wrong by design, to trap what should not be free. Elias's skin crawled. Read on. They are not ghosts. Ghosts are echoes of the dead. These are something else. Parasites from a place adjacent to our own, drawn to strong emotion. They feed on fear, on sorrow, on madness. They have no form of their own, so they borrow ours. They whisper our own thoughts back to us, twisted and poisoned. They show us our deepest fears in the shadows. The house walls are a barrier, but the barrier is weakening. The angles are shifting. They are learning to speak. The final entry was the most chilling. I can hear them in the walls now. They have learned my name. They speak with the voice of my dead wife. They promise me I can see her again if I just let them in. The temptation is immense. God help me, the geometry is failing. The center cannot hold. A sudden, violent crash from the floor made Elias jump to his feet, the papers scattering. Heart in his throat, he ran out of the library. One of the massive portraits that lined the staircase had fallen, its ancient canvas torn, the stern-faced ancestor now staring blankly at the ceiling from a frame of splintered wood. But it isn't the fall that froze the blood in Elias's veins. It was the sound that followed. From the space behind where the portrait had hung, a low, wet, gurgling sound emerged. It was the sound of something choking, something drowning on dry land. And then, a whisper, thick and flamy, slithered out of the dark cavity in the wall. "Alistair, we are still hungry." Elias did not sleep that night. He barricaded himself in the study, pushing a heavy bookcase against the door. The whispers were no longer confined to faint sounds. They were now clear, distinct voices, and they were having conversations just on the other side of the door. He heard his mother's voice, dead for 10 years, pleading with him to open the door. He heard the voice of an old college rival, mocking his failures. He heard his own voice, whispering secrets he had never told a soul. He was losing his mind. He knew it with a cold, clinical certainty. But the knowledge did nothing to stop the process. The house was getting inside him, wearing down his sanity like water on stone. The next morning, bleared and trembling, he knew he had to find a way to fight back. His useless notes mentioned containment. A nexus. It had to be the geometric pattern. It was the key. He spent the day in a feverish haze, photographing the pattern on his bedroom wall with his phone and studying the images. He cross-referenced the symbols with those in his useless books. It was a locking mechanism, a complex equation designed to keep a door shut. But his uncle believed it was failing. That evening, as the shadows lengthened and the whispers began to coalesce into a single, menacing hum, Elias made a decision. He would try to reinforce the pattern. He found a piece of charcoal in the study and went to his bedroom. Standing before the wall, he began to trace over the fading lines, trying to deepen them, to make them whole again. As he worked, the temperature in the room plummeted. His breath plumed in the air. The whispers grew louder, more agitated. "You cannot fix it," a voice hissed from the wardrobe. It was his own voice, laced with venom. "You are not Alistair. You lack the will. The angles are broken," another voice, dissonant like grinding stones, came from the floorboards. "The door is already ajar." Elias ignored them, his hand shaking as he carefully redrew a complex spiral. But as he completed the line, the charcoal in his hand snapped. At the same moment, a section of the pattern on the wall seemed to waver. The lines blurred, swimming before his eyes. For a terrifying second, the wall ceased to be solid. He saw a glimpse of something beyond, a swirling, phosphorescent grayness, a landscape of impossible shapes and a sound like a million souls screaming in unison. Then it snapped back. The wall was solid again. But the pattern was different. A key part of the design was now altered, twisted into a new, malevolent shape. How could not repaired it? How could made it worse? A wave of pure, undiluted terror washed over him. How stumbled back from the wall, tripping over his own feet and landing hard on the floor. From the newly distorted section of the pattern, a shadow began to bleed out onto the plaster. It was not a cast shadow, it was a pool of absolute blackness that defied the light in the room. It spread, thickening, and began to rise from the wall, taking on a form. It was roughly humanoid, but its limbs were too long, its head a featureless oval. It moved with a jerky, unnatural grace, and as it stepped fully free of the wall, the room seemed to dim. The whispers fell silent, replaced by a deep, resonant drumming that vibrated in Elias's bones. This was no whisper. This was one of them. And it was now in the room with him. The entity took a step towards him. Elias scrambled backward, his back hitting the bedframe. Hal could feel a cold radiating from the thing, a cold that sucked the warmth and hope from the air. It raised a long, shadowy limb, and a single, whispered word echoed not in the room, but directly inside Elias's skull. Mine! Elias screamed. Hal kicked out, his foot passing through the creature's form with a sensation of intense, soul-numbing cold. It was like plunging his leg into liquid nitrogen. The thing seemed unfazed, leaning closer. Hal could see now that its featureless face isn't entirely blank. It was a swirling vortex of faint, tortured expressions, a screaming mouth here, a weeping eye there, all constantly forming and dissolving. It was made of the remnants of the people it had consumed. With a final, desperate lunge, Elias rolled under the bed. Hal curled into a ball, clutching the knife, listening. Hal heard a soft, shuffling sound. Then a long, shadowy arm snaked under the bed, fingers of pure darkness stretching towards his face. Hal slashed at it with the knife. The blade passed through, but the thing recoiled with a hiss that sounded like steam escaping a fissure in the earth. It was not hurt, but it was annoyed. The arm retreated. For a long moment, there was silence. Then, the entire bed was lifted into the air with impossible force and flung against the far wall with a splintering crash. Elias was exposed. The entity loomed over him. Hal was going to die here. His mind, fractured by days of terror, finally began to shut down. But in that moment of absolute despair, a memory surfaced. His woundless knots. They feed on fear. What if Hal stopped being afraid? It was an insane thought. But it was the only one Hal had. As the creature reached for him, its cold touch making his skin blister with frost, Elias did the hardest thing Hal had ever done. Hal closed his eyes. Hal thought of his sterile, quiet apartment. Hal thought of the clean, predictable logic of his code. Hal focused on the warmth of a summer sun Hal hadn't felt in days. Hal forced his breathing to slow. Hal imagined building a wall in his mind, not of fear, but of pure, emotionless data. The cold receded slightly. The drumming in his head lessened. Hal opened his eyes. The entity was still there, but it seemed less substantial, more confused. It tilted its head. Fear, it whispered in his mind, but the voice was weaker. No, Elias said, his voice a rock. There is no fear. Hal pushed himself to his feet, his body screaming in protest. Hal stood before the shifting horror, his mind a blank slate. Hal thought of mathematical formulas. Hal recited prime numbers. Hal visualized the binary code for null. The creature flickered. It took a step back, towards the wall. The distorted pattern on the wall was glowing with a sickly green light. The pattern, Elias realized. It is a conduit. My fear powers it. My calm closes it. Hal took a step forward, maintaining his mental discipline. The entity shrank back, its form beginning to unravel at the edges, streaming like black smoke back towards the wall. With a final, silent shriek that echoed only in the realm of thought, it was sucked back into the geometric design. The lines on the wall flared brightly and then returned to their normal state, the correct, original state, Hal noticed with a shock. His act of will had not just repelled the creature, it had repaired the lock. The room was silent. The oppressive cold was gone. The whispers had ceased. Elias stood there for a long time, trembling not with fear, but with exhaustion and the aftershock of survival. Hal had done it. Hal had faced the horror and won. Hal spent the rest of the night in the study, too terrified to return to the bedroom. As dawn broke, painting the sky in hues of rose and gold, Hal felt a fragile sense of peace. The house was quiet. Truly quiet. The 30 requirement no longer seemed like a prison sentence. It was a challenge Hal could now meet. Hal decided to make a cup of tea on the old gas stove in the kitchen, a small, normal act of defiance against the madness. As Hal waited for the kettle to boil, Hal gazed out the kitchen window at the overgrown garden. The rain had stopped, and the world was washed clean. And then Hal saw it. A figure. Standing at the edge of the tree line. It was a woman, dressed in a white, old-fashioned gown. She was too far away to see her face clearly, but she was looking directly at the house. At him. His blood ran cold. Was it another one? A different manifestation. As Hal watched, frozen, the woman raised a hand and waved. It was not a menacing gesture. It was slow, almost sad. Then she turned and walked into the woods, disappearing into the shadows. The kettle began to scream, a shrill, desperate sound that ripped through the newfound silence. Elias jumped, his heart hammering again. Hal turned off the gas, his hands shaking. Hal had defeated the thing in the wall. Hal had mastered his fear. But as Hal looked out at the empty tree line, a new, more insidious dread began to take root. The entity had been a predator, a clear and present danger. This was different. It was a mystery. An invitation. The house had shown him its teeth. Now, it was showing him its secrets. And Elias Thorne, against his every instinct for self-preservation, knew that Hal could not leave. Not until Hal found out what, or who, the woman in white was. The 30 days stretched before him, not as a countdown to freedom, but as a descent into a deeper, more terrifying truth. The whispers in the walls had been silenced. But the house itself was still breathing. And it was far from done with him.